And, next semester, you're going to be doing some searches in PsychInfo. So this slide might actually be a little. Google Scholar runs much the same way. If you find somebody like Dr. Sheldon or like myself, and you search on our names, you'll come up with a Google Scholar citation. That'll tell you how much scientific impact they have. It'll also tell you what articles they wrote that are most highly cited. And it will give you maybe some other ideas for search things that you might look at. The other thing about that is it will also give you some ideas of other researchers in the area. So if you search on me, you'll find out that I do a lot of work with Ken Schur, and you can click on Ken Schur and see all the stuff that he's up to. Sometimes that helps you understand a research program, even if it's not, even if the topics kind of vary quite a bit. Because even within the field of alcohol, the stuff we've done here at the University of Missouri has involved things like, does our fraternity and sorority system produce fake IDs for people to drink illegally? You betcha, and it varies by particular frat houses. There's a whole literature on training, for example, that there are students who actually intentionally try to get drunk so that they can increase their tolerance so they're not a wimp. And what's really sad to me is men and women who drink a lot of alcohol because they want to be able to hold their liquor on the day that they get married, stuff like that. And then there's me with the 8 o'clock in the morning Friday classes. And there's all those things might be kind of hard to nail down with search terms, but by looking at the people and figuring out what they're doing, you can sort of get a flavor for different types of college alcohol research. Because if you just search on college students and alcohol, you'll get a whole variety of things, and maybe not those that are most key to what goes on the campus. Now, I updated this a little bit, so if you've downloaded the spreadsheet, the PowerPoint, be sure to download the more recent copy. It's a Google Doc, so it's updated in what I changed it. Sometimes some of you maybe argue with people on social media, or you argue with people in residence halls, or you argue with people in coffee shops, and you'll say, well, just do your research. Just Google it. We'll see what's going on there. And it might surprise some of you to know that the results that you get back from Google are a little bit different depending on who you are and depending on where you live. So the results that I have when I search on something are quite different than my co-author in Germany, who's kind of a conservative, Alternative für Deutschland type person. And it's kind of, what is that? It's kind of like the vaccine deniers, kind of the nationalists in Germany. So that when he searches, he sees news things from Fox and The Blaze and other conservative outlets. When I search, I see like .gov articles and NPR and stuff like that. This is because one of the things that Google does is it looks at your search history and it tries to give you the results that it thinks you want. Your IP address, the little number that's stored in your devices that shows where you are and allows our government to track where you've been and what you've been doing, also affects the type of search that you have. So if you're in Texas, or if you start out with the Texas IP, your search results are going to be a little bit different. The time of day also influences searches. I mentioned your browser search history. Now, there's other things that Google knows about you. So if you've been searching for new tennis shoes, if you've been searching for survivalist equipment, your search results are going to look a little bit different on Google, on Facebook, other social media sites, depending on that fact. And of course, it's always about the money. There are sites that Google has that are paid by advertisers, they're targeted. Most recently, evidently, you need to opt in to allowing your personal information for this, which is, I think, a really wonderful thing because a lot of us are lazy. And now Google flags those ads with the ad in the upper left-hand corner, so you can see those things. Well, so when I'm using Google, to reason scientifically, what can I do to minimize the effects of this problem? Well, you can use another browser and not be signed into Google. In the upper right-hand corner, you can sign out of who you are. You can use Firefox. You can use any of the other browsers that are out there. You can use another search engine like DuckDuckGo, or you can go out and get a VPN. Sorry, that's a little bit of typo, a virtual private network. And inside of Google, you can go into your settings, advanced privacy and security, and you can clear the browsing data. And that will clear all your cookies. It does not necessarily help to open an incognito window. Sometimes the results are a little bit different. The incognito window does not anonymize you. Inside your incognito window, I believe you can still access some of the cookies you've had. You just won't leave a trail on. A lot of websites, if you look at The Guardian in England, or if you access the German news service or the French news service, the European Union has privacy controls in it, and it'll have a little flag on the bottom saying, this site uses cookies to keep track of this, do you allow it? Well, you can opt out of that, and that will also not keep that visit from affecting your search results. And you can also get things like privacy badging. I don't use it myself, but it's available from the Now, playing around with Google is a little different than playing around with Google Scholar or PsychInfo. So if you're wanting to look at hashtags or Twitter mentions, of course, you can put a pound sign in front of things. So you can like Google Thursday, Columbia, Missouri. That'll give you a lot of ads for the local bars in town. It is unfortunately the case that our merchants are targeting. If you're looking for a price of something, put a dollar sign in front of it. So you say $400 computers, and it'll give you search results from computers that are close to $400. You're probably going to see ads in the beginning for people with that. If you want to make sure that there are things that are not mentioned, you put a minus sign in front of them. Like if you want to Google the word time, but you don't want all the references to magazine, Time magazine happening, you say Time minus magazine. You say $400 computer space minus Lenovo if you don't want to look at computers for whatever reason. The book makes a huge deal about searching for reputable websites. .edu and .gov sites are maybe going to give you information that's a little different than, say, your average YouTube post. So you can say site::gov, and that will give you in your search all of the .gov sites. And if you want something that's kind of sort of in the area of a website, you can say related : So if you say, if you're searching for related : Missouri.edu, it's going to give you, UMROLA, UMSL, and so forth, all of those websites. And not necessarily the Missouri.edu, because if you search on Missouri.edu, you're going to get the Missouri website. So those are just kind of some handy tips. The related thing is kind of handy if you're looking at, say, adolescence. You can use wildcards, or you can say related to adolescence. Say you've got a budget, and you're looking at ranges of things, you can put a ... in the middle. So you can say computers that cost between $400 and $2,000. And I should put quotes around them. When you're searching, use and or. That will get you into topics. There are multiple terms inside your search. Inside of Google search, there's a lot of advanced search options. So you can look at what's been posted in the past year, what's been posted in a given year, particular flags, images that you might search. You can search on the size and so forth. When you're fact checking things, you see a picture of something or you see a video, it's very helpful to use Google Images. Just type in Google Images and then click on another tab, maybe the picture you're wondering about, and drag it into Google Images. you'll get somewhat of a sense of where this image has appeared and whether or not it's maybe, if you're lucky, some information as to whether it's just photoshopped and faked or not. That's kind of helpful. Anything on that? So this is, if memory serves an old man well, kind of where I was leading out. When the Earth's outer crust was cooling in college students, I got in touch with APA style. And I thought, this is absolutely the most boring way to write something. But next semester, when you write your projects, when you write your articles, there's going to be 6 parts to an article. And it's important to know a little bit about what these parts are. Every research article always has these parts to it. There's an abstract. It is usually a very teeny tiny amount of text, like 250 words, period, that says what you did. Very frequently, the abstract is something you obsess over because it's the only thing many people are going to read about. And for that reason, when you do a search on PsychInfo, the abstract to the article very frequently comes up. Looking at abstracts can give you ideas for search terms, and looking at abstracts can also give you an idea of the major conclusions from the study. So if you're sorting out your studies that have support for the death threat or a support for implicit bias, you'll get an idea of, is this falling down on one side or the other side on that. There's an introduction, generally speaking. If you're typing this out, about 3 to 5 pages long of typewritten material, usually a page and a half inside the article, that says, here's what I'm looking at, this is why it's a problem, and this is why I think I should look at it and how I might go about looking at it. There's a method section. The method section says what actually happened in the research. It consists of the participants, who did your study, how did you select them, who decided not to participate in your study, how is the people you ended up with different than the initial population of people you were trying to contact, the instruments, what surveys did you get to people, and the procedure, that is, what actually happened when you were doing your study. Participants to the room, parrots sit over there, you presented the following stimulus, which goes to them and so forth. The results section consists of the statistical analysis. So here's where the hypotheses that you have generated are evaluated using statistical techniques. Here we will get the answers. Downstairs, there's a discussion. What does this study show? Generally speaking, the discussion section, first of all, reminds the reader what the hell happened up here, what went on, and what the conclusion is usually, and then proceeds to a discussion of what the limitations of the study were. So here's where you think, what could go wrong? What are the limits to knowledge that I still have, even though I didn't study? And hopefully, at the end of the day, even though I have all these limitations, here's what I think I know based on this. And we have the references, the articles which are cited. Now, APA style is really incredibly anal retentive. They talk a lot about the headings. There's a title, there's a level 1 heading, a level 2 heading, or level 3 headings. References have to look a certain way. Everything's double spaced. And that's kind of a pain in the butt. So Ben, you remember him, is working on a video to introduce you to APA style inside of Word, because, asking a few of you, Word is what most of you are using. And 9 times out of 10, when people are using Word, they go, oh, gee, all right, I've got to center this and underline it and bold it. And they do that every time for every level 1 heading. And inside of Word, there's this thing called style sheet. So you can just click on your paragraph and it will have the correct level of indentation and the appropriate style. So more on that later. So when you read an empirical article, you need to think about what are they arguing? What are they trying to show? And sometimes that can take a little while for you to figure out. And at the end of the day, what's going on? And the reason that becomes difficult, and we'll talk about this when we get more into chapter 3, is the construct, say, school achievement, and the operationalization of the construct, like grades or test results, are often two different things. So, for example, I'm sure we've all had classes where, yeah, I got a grade, but it didn't really help what I knew. Maybe the test results are better, or maybe the fact that I went on to take another class and I showed a lot of mastery in that class because of what I learned in the class before is really a better measure of how much I learned. Well, so when you're making an argument, you kind of balance what's going on here. What case are they trying to make and how convincing is that? And then take a look at the evidence. So, I've mentioned a few things about how to be skeptical about research in my area of college. Sometimes there's one or two students who are really, really worlds different than other people. And they affect the results. They reflect the means, they reflect the correlation coefficients I might see in my data. When you're reading chapters and review articles, it's a big survey. It's a little like reading a novel. And you're probably looking at a whole bunch of studies that are very summarized. And those generally have a context. So if you're in developmental psychology, you might see that there's a whole bunch of studies done from the field of education. You might see that there's a whole bunch of studies in social work. There's a whole bunch of studies done in medical schools, all of them looking at kids, but thinking of children as different things essentially. Now, chapters, when they're well written, are attempts to take all of these different research contexts and talk about how they focus on one given problem, and which are perhaps more or less believable. And just as before, there's going to be some evidence in it, but now your task is going to be to think about several articles. We talk a little bit about, yeah, you can go into Barnes and Nobles in the mall here, and you can see what's on offer. Wikis, there's Wikimedia, there's Wikipedia, there's Mediapedia, and there's the popular press. Very frequently, these things are useful. They might point you to things that you haven't thought about before. They might point you to things you haven't stumbled across before. But of course, be aware that these more popular sources are not reviewed, and some of them are in to make money. Therefore, there's a controversy inside psychology about the power pose that you would be viewed as, more successful and forceful and more effective if you stand with your feet wide apart and your hands on your hips. People make a lot of money though lecturing about power pose. I want to get a little bit into chapter 3. So this is a chapter where you're going to get into some of the jargon. So as you're reading the textbook, at the end there'll be like key terms. And here's where you're going to be starting to find these terms. And you have two goals in here. One is, what are the terms I need to know? And then how do these terms get used in practice? Now, she organizes this in terms of 3 claims, research claims, association, frequency, and so forth, and validity. And so at the end of this, we're going to be talking about our 3 claims and 4 validities and how we use those to think skeptically about the research article that we're looking at. So when we've got to start my discipline of not saying it's so quite so much. When we're looking at a research program, We have constructs, conceptual variables, operational definitions, and variables. And these are from the more general to the more specific. And the reason that we're using these three terms and you don't use them interchangeably is it's always important to keep track of at what level you want to have this discussion. The constructs up here are the most general. They are the ideas, academic achievement, self-esteem, self-worth, self-efficacy. That is the feeling that you can be an agent in your own life. I mean, those are the elements of the theory in its most abstract fashion. There are operational definitions. That is, as I'm thinking about the construct, because psychology is an empirical science, I'm going to have to, for the purposes of research, make some kind of a concrete definition of what I want to have. So I might say operationally, fear could be a galvanic skin, will be operationalized by a galvanic skin response, how moisture on gets when exposed to a stimulus. Or I might talk about academic success as the number of years required to complete the college degree. And that's not going to necessarily be the be all and end all here. We could just have sweaty skin, walk across things. Now that might affect your operational definition. Success might not be finishing college. I just talked with a young woman last week who's had 33 majors. That's a lot of majors. You know, I don't think the person is a failure. They were just very multi-potential. Operational definitions then beget our variables, the concrete numbers. The GPA at the end of the semester, the score on the Miller Analogies test, or the Beck Depression individual. So it is these variables that are the stuff of the actual study. Now, at each level, you can criticize each and every one of these things, because at the end of the day, if your construct is entirely messed up, it doesn't really matter how you operationally define the actual variables that you observe. So I was trying to think of a way outside the book to think about what types of problems could go on. We'll show that in a moment. There's 4 different types of validities when you're criticizing something. The construct. I can also criticize this on statistical grounds. I can talk about the criticism of the internal validity of the study. That is this actually a good study of the relationship between this variable and that variable? And I can talk about the external validity. Are the results of my study generalizable to other people, other populations? Does what I conclude about male students generalize to female students, and vice versa, or first generation students to non-first generation students? So let's talk about what these terms are and how this will help us focus on how we want to criticize a research article or a research program. So more generally, when looking at a construct, this is a statement of what you're looking at, school achievement. And if you're looking at operational definitions, they're different. You can ask somebody, as you do on teaching things, do you think you're going to get an A in this class or B? You can go to school records, you can go to teacher evaluations. Teacher evaluations are just as invalid as self-ratings. Generally speaking, teachers tend to be higher than men. They tend to rate better dressed people than poorly dressed people. It's kind of interesting if you look back at the history of the IQ test. They developed the IQ test not as a way to put people in boxes, but because in France tests were oral. child showed up and was interviewing for his private teacher. And they realized that in class, teachers were very much keying in on, oh, what did the student dress? How did they well spoken? Did they do all of these socially acceptable things that one thinks children were supposed to do? We didn't have a multiple choice test unless I was in America. For an awful long time in Germany, everything was verbalized. You had a test, you dressed for it, and you showed up on time, and you made sure that nothing about politics was talked about because the instructors were much more religiously conservative than the student population generally. So the IQ test was thought to be a blind way of trying to assess intellectual abilities. It's interesting to see that it kind of gets messed up as we industrialize education. If you're going to criticize a construct, that's going to be done outside the research program. So are the physical products of classroom exercises really a measure of school achievement? Or is it maybe a measure of how hungry the child was that morning because they didn't get fed? Should we actually be measuring what students remember afterward? So yeah, you did everything really great in class, but if none of it sticks, the book talks repeatedly, a year from now, you should be able to ... Well, they're pointing at the issue that achievement in this class and in a lot of other classes is really a function of what you can carry with you. Is it the case that a standardized test is a good measure of learning? Might not be. What if I write a really good essay? What if I was willing to write books in the area? Oh, well, in organized group learning, we can all have these research projects, and in the medical school, for example, we have this thing called problem-based learning. That is, this is also in the vet school. We give you a sick horse, we give you a patient with a complaint, and we tell the team of medical students what's going on, what would you order, what would you do? And it's a group exercise, and you're graded as a group. Now, one of the things I think goes on with problem-based learning is none of the students trust the other students, so they end up studying an awful lot more than they normally would because they don't trust their colleagues. But the idea of a successful group in that situation is much like the idea of having a successful veterinary or medical practice. You make intelligent decisions based on everybody who's in the room and the as yet incomplete information that you might have. Maybe a story that just ain't so. It might reflect a social construct. You tend to think, unfortunately in America in education, there's this industrial model that, some of our products that we produce in the university is something somehow that the professors are doing, which it's not. We're doing it, and that product can be somehow evaluated as excellent or not excellent. The criticism of the construct is hard to refute empirically because there's just a whole bunch of assumptions that went into this prior to it. And I'll get to an example about this when we talk about something called the Unilinear cultural evolution. Anybody ever heard of it? Yeah, fire away.
Isn't supposed to be like, it shouldn't be advanced.
How do you use your teacher voice through the mask? I'm sorry.
Sorry. So if I remember correctly, it's basically a culture like culture's advanced enough to all of the same place.
Exactly. So this was really popular in America for some time. Also comes to us from England. The thinking is, in its original form, that all cultures pass through 4 stages: hunter and gatherer, pastoral, and agriculture and commerce. Now, hunter and gatherer. I got several problems with this picture as somebody who used to hunt. First of all, if you're going to get that elk, why would you be dressing like other elk? Because if the other elk notice you, it's not going to be a good thing. You're going to be fighting for territory. And how did they get the great big antlers to sit on top of their heads? I mean, you need a chin strap or something there. And if you're going to be assaulting an animal with a spear, why are you carrying a bow and quiver? But okay, and they're white guys. How did they get their beards so short? At any rate, the second phase is pastoralism. You raise cattle and you move around a lot. You raise birds. And then there's agriculture. You raise food. As a matter of fact, if you get a chance, if you have not been to them, visit Cahokia in St. Louis. It's an ancient pyramid. Is it on the Illinois side? It is, okay. And they have, you have your own Stonehenge there. Unfortunately, we destroyed a lot of it to put a railroad through it. But that was an example of an agricultural society. And then at the bottom, we have commerce. So capitalism is the end point of cultural evolution. And the thinking was in the 1700s, 1800s, nationalism and economic capitalism, that all the societies that we see are kind of time experiments. And all you had to do was look around to you, and there were some people who were still stuck in that hunting and gathering stage, and other people who were nomads, and others who were agriculture, and therefore they were inferior. Because after all, the end point was commerce. Comes to us from Scottish philosophers in the 1700s, and the idea was all cultures have to go through each and every one. Cultures are natural experiments. Some of them are stunted and underdeveloped, perhaps due to the racist ideas of the time, the fact that some of them were genetically inferior. So, the Chinese, for example, were inferior because they did not have the influence relative to the capitalists. Problems with this, it ignores the fact that people live the way they do in response to the resources and challenges of their area. You are not going to have a capitalist society in the sub-Saharan. You just can't do it. In the North American continent, the reason you had to move around, you had to graze because we depleted certain things. Actually, our Native Americans were outstanding farmers. They knew how to farm. They knew the land. Some societies actually appear to skip levels. So one of the people that I worked with was in New Guinea. They went from hunting and gathering right on into commerce. Supposedly we couldn't do that. Now, that was a really bad, it's a really bad idea. And America's racist history is not just people running around in white robes and people smiling. Teddy Roosevelt was an avowed racist. And his vice president visited the Philippines after it was taken from the Spanish and said, "We're never giving you democracy because you are children. You just could not do democracy." And there was this idea that the Aryan race follows the sun. The Aryans would come from over in Georgia, they spread through Germany and England and France, and then they came to America. And at the end of the day, the Aryan race was destined to circle the globe by ever proceeding in westward fashion. And here's a little quote in the bottom. "It's the crowning and greatest achievement of a series of mighty movements, and it must be taken in connection with them. It will be lost unless we grasp, however, the race history of the nations who took part therein." And that's Teddy. If you want, there's a wonderful book called Imperial Grooves, and I put a link to it there, which talks about the problems that America had. one of them was that, you know, we're going to expand, America hit the Pacific, and we're supposed to ever go westward. Well, in problems when you get across that Pacific Ocean, the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians are already there, and they got boats. So what can we do? Well, there's these people called the Japanese. We're going to tell them they're not really Asian. They're Aryans. And we're going to go in and force them to trade with us and tell them that they're better and say, go ahead and invade Korea and China because they're Asians and genetically inferior. You are Aryans. This led to the excesses of World War I and Iwo Jima. The Japanese said, well, the Aryans, it's our goal, it's our objective to invade. The Imperial Crew's book was written by a son of someone whose father was a Iwo Jima. So, the old John Burgess was a person that really admired. And again, waxed very poetic about this Anglo-Saxon Teutonic group of beings. And it's the mission of the white man to spread democracy around the world. And the state is the invention of the Teuton, and the organs of state should be controlled only by those with Teutonic blood, no dark others in the blood. It was part of our national politics at that time to adopt these very racial arguments. Well, at this level, we're doing this construct criticism. Notice I haven't talked about did you actually go in and test people. If you're going to criticize a construct, there are fundamental values. Does this violate human dignity? Does this violate an idea of respect for multiculturalism? A lot of our museums of the time in the early 1900s and 1800s are kind of a mess because we didn't appreciate how artifacts fulfill different roles in different societies. So, you know, here's a rattle from Africa, here's one from China, here's one from Java, without appreciating that a rattle might be something that you give to a child in one culture, it might be something used in the religious rite in another culture, and it might be something that's actually used to drive snakes out of your dwelling place in yet another culture. And there are other construct terms that are maybe more precise or productive, and that they will lead to a research agenda. Unilinear culturalism was not really testable, or to the extent that it was testable, you can go out and find, say, cultures that do scale.